As we all know, configuring the joystick and throttle in Flight Simulator 2024 isn't that easy, and the default profiles are not very useful. In this video I will show you how to configure the Thrustmaster T.16000M mic in combination with the TWCS throttle. Let's roll the intro and then let's look at how to do that. So we're in the cockpit of the Cessna 172 Skyhawk, and what we're going to do is we're going to configure the joystick and the throttle, as already mentioned in the intro. If you would keep them by default, there will be a lot of overlap in functionality, which is a kind of a pity. So the plan is as follows. First we start with the basic controls, right? Which simply means, okay, we're going to make sure that we can steer the aircraft, we're going to make sure that we can taxi the aircraft and can increase and decrease the throttling, as well as adjust the trim wheel, right? Because those are the basic functionalities which you will need to have. Then after that, we're gonna move to the next step. And in that next step, what we're gonna do is add some additional functionality. For example, configure a button to switch on the aircraft, right? Start the engines. But also, for example, create a button where we can configure the autopilot, or multiple buttons likely, but also to switch the autopilot on and off using one single button. Once we've done that, right, we've got a few buttons left, and we're gonna look at the video later in the video how we can use that. In this case, right, for example, what you could do is use it for gear up and down, although that's not applicable to the Cessna 172, but might be applicable to another aircraft. But there likely are some other functionalities which we can use those buttons for. So let's start with the configuration. So the first thing you need to do, of course, is you need to go to the settings menu. The settings menu, right, if you hit escape on the computer, and then it will bring you to this menu, you go to controls, and there you will find both the TWCS throttle as well as the T16000 mic. So what we want to do is we want to start with the T16000 mic, right, which is the joystick. I've got an older version, not this one, but an older version, but I would say the buttons are still the same. So we're going to make a duplication of the default profile. That's not entirely needed because you could also say, hey, I'm going to use a different one. But in this case, I'm going to use this one to copy it. And then I'm going to clear it completely. So what I'm going to do is going to provide it with a new name, right? Because else we'll get this name. So I'm going to say T16000 mic plus TWCS. And I don't select these buttons, because if you select these buttons, then the joystick will be applied to all the aircrafts, or the configuration will be applied to all the aircrafts. And I also won't mark it as default because I've got different controllers and I won't want to use this one as a default. So the same thing is applicable to that next section, right? Because these are the general controls, but these are the airplane's controls. So we're going to make also a copy of this one. We're going to select the text, if it allows us. T16000 mic plus TWCS. Again, don't select any of the other options. This is just the basic configuration for the joystick. Now it's super important that you do this step, and that's say clear, because this will clear the existing configuration, because I don't want to use any of the default configuration. And we're going to do the same thing here, right? So clear the configuration. So now everything should be cleared, and if you want to validate that, you can go to the bottom section and filter unassigned controllers, and you can see it's completely empty, which is good. And then you can bring it either back to none, or you can set to essential. That really depends on what you prefer. The essential one contains the, let's say, default aircraft systems, which you really need to have for flying an aircraft. While the other section, right, the none, contains a lot of more items, as you can see over here. The nice thing about this whole, let's say, system is that you can also search, right? So I can search, for example, if I want to search for axis, I will get everything where the word axis is in, including the condition leveler, the mixture axis, the propeller axis, the throttle axis, the flaps, as you can see, the rudder axis, and a lot of other cool things. Now there are a few things which you need to keep in mind. If there's general in front of it, it means it's the general controls. So it will be added to this part of the profile. If there's airplanes, it will be added to this part of the profile. In some scenarios, there is a special one. Of course, it's not here, but there's a special label where it says specific, and in that case, they will be assigned to this profile, which by default set to none, but you can configure something, and you will see that we will do that a little bit later in this video. So for this part, we want to configure this one, right? The joystick itself. We want to make sure that we can steer the aircraft and make sure that we can, say, go airborne. So what we're going to do is we're going to search for our axis. And those axes is a pretty long list, as you can see. But based on my experience, it's really easy, because what we need to do is you need to find one of the axes, in this case the aileron axis and the elevator axis, because those are the axes which allows us to control the aircraft. So we're going to set the elevator axis. I'm going to pull the joystick towards me, which means that the joystick L axis Y is set. And the aileron axis, I move it to the left, which means that the joystick L axis X is set. Right, so this is the basic configuration, but there's one other thing which we of course want to do, because we also want to steer the aircraft, and that's the rudder axis. The rudder axis, you can press it and then you can turn the joystick. If you turn the joystick, it will be assigned to the joystick air axis Z from Zulu, and this should give us the basic controls already. So to make sure that we are on the correct, let's say, pace, what we're gonna do is we're gonna go to the aircraft. But before doing that, we need to configure one additional button. And the reason why we need to do it, because else we can't watch from the outside. If we watch from the inside, we should be perfectly fine. But if you want to also look from the outside, then make sure that you search for this. Search for cockpit. And then if you move to the top, you will see a button called with external view mode. So we're going to use this one, and then I'm going to press this button over here. It's also shown in the top left of this video which button I press. So I'm going to press it, and this assigns joystick button 3. So let's see if it works, right? So let's hit escape, escape, escape. So we're now inside the cockpit. Now we're outside of the cockpit, but you can see I can't turn anyway, right? So this is the basic thing. So what we're going to do now is move the joystick to the right, and you can see that this part of the aircraft is moving, to the left works, and then of course the other items are working. So both the rudder, the aileron as the elevator are now working. So we already configured, I would say, 3 items, plus as a bonus item, we created the ability to go inside the cockpit, where you can of course also use those buttons, right? So if I move the joystick, you can see that it moves the yoke. And if I would say move the mouse now a little bit, because I'm using the mouse to control, and I would hide the yoke, then you can see that I also can use the rudder, which is really easy. Now, of course, the next thing would be, okay, hey, now we're there, right? There are a few things which you want to do when you're in the aircraft. First thing is you likely want to start the aircraft, because if it's not started, it will not work. So let's look at that, and then in combination with that, what we're going to do is we're also going to configure a button where we can release the parking brake, because that's over here, right? So the parking brake, it's now currently being set, but I would say likely we want to uncheck it, right? Or now it's set, toggle position off. Right here you can see what we can do. So if we would move it like this, right, you can still see I can change the rudder, but if I would use the brake, it won't be applicable. So I'm going to go to the settings again. And inside the settings, I will go to the controls. I will make sure that the T16000 mic is selected. And then I'm going to search initially for, let's say, the engine, right? Because that's the first thing you want to do. And if you search for engine, you'll see a lot of options, right? You can see the engines, both the generic ones, which are, let's say, for example, can be used to use one axis or one button to control all the engines. And you'll also see the individual buttons to control the individual controls for the engines, right? In this case, the NTI settings. But what we of course want to do is we want to simply switch on the engine and stop it. So to switch on the engine, you need to search for engine auto stop, and I'm gonna press this button over here. Again, it's shown also in the left top of this video. So I'm going to press it, press the button, and for stopping the engine, I'm going to use this one. So I'm going to press it and then hit it again. So button number 5 and 10 are being used to start and stop the engine of the aircraft. Now there's of course another thing, and that's, as already mentioned, that's the parking brake. So let's search for parking brake. You'll have two options, right? There's the set the parking brake, which will simply set the parking brake to on. But if you also want to switch to off, then you can better use the toggle parking brakes, because that allows you to switch it on or off. And here you see that one where I mentioned, hey, you also have the specific category. Because if you search for toggle parking brakes, if you would look here, it's a little bit different name. It's parking brake toggle, which is exactly the same. But then in the specific category, all of them are digital, which simply means that you need to press a button, where in some cases where you see axis, you really need to assign a controller which has an axis, for example, the joystick itself. So I'm going to say toggle this one, and then I'm going to press the button number 6, which is this one, also shown in the top of this video, and that is now being configured. Now, of course, we also want to make sure that we can brake the aircraft, right? So if we brake the aircraft, we also need to do something. So brake the aircraft, again, if you search for brake, you will find tons of options, including, let's say, applicable to the airplanes, but also the specific ones, as you can see, right? So those are, I would say, really useful. So I'm gonna do one thing now, and that's, I would say, search for it, right? So disarm the auto brake is not the case. The parking brakes are not the case. Left brake and right brake, these are the axes, right? So here you can use an axis to control the braking. But in this case, what we want to do is we want to simply brake the aircraft. And that can also be done, of course. But let's search for it. And that's likely this one, the brakes, because here you can see the left and the right brake, so you can individually control them. But in this case, because we've got a limited number of buttons, we want to use this one. And I'm going to use this controller button over here. Oh, press it again. Here we go, button number 9. So now we configure the first 4 buttons. So let's see if it works. And that's always my recommendation, to test it in between, right? Because if you're not testing it in between, it will not work. And as you can see, I can now switch off the engine with a lot of alerts. And I can also start the engine. And the auto start engine is, let's say, I always call it a little bit fake starting the engine, right? Because you don't do a lot of your things yourself. But that also has to do with the limited number of controls. Although you could, for example, use the leveler on the T16000 mic to control, for example, the mixture. That could be an option, right? I didn't do it in this video, but you're free to do so. Now the aircraft is running, right? Everything is nice. Of course, what we want to do is we want to increase the throttle. But besides that, we also want to do something else, right? So I'm going to zoom in a bit and then move to this wheel. Because this wheel, the pitch trim, is super important and you need to use it a lot. But there's also a huge warning about this one. If you use it, let's say, too fast, you will definitely crash your aircraft. So let's have a look at how we can, let's say, configure the button to be used, but also prevent that it will oversteer the aircraft. To do that, what we're going to do is we're going to use the throttle. The TWCS throttle, as you can see over here, has a nice wheel on this end, which we're going to use to adjust the trim. And we're going to use, of course, the leveler to, let's say, control the aircraft or to control the engine. So we're going to first duplicate the profile, which is the default one. But you can pick any profile because we're going to clear the configuration. Plus TWCS. Hit OK. I'm going to do the next thing, or the same thing actually, to this one. So I'm going to say, okay, hey, T16000 mic plus TWCS, and then hit OK. And after we've done that, we need to clear the configuration. So what we're going to do is we're going to press this button, say clear, hit OK, and then do the next thing also with that one. So now the configuration is completely cleared. Again, you can validate if it's cleared by setting the filter to assigned. So we're going to search for a throttle, right? Because that's something we first want to do. We want to make sure that we can use the throttle for the aircraft so that we can increase the speed of the aircraft, but also decrease And that's where you can find a lot of options when you search for throttle. Now again, the same thing is applicable as already discussed for the other parts, that you have, let's say, generic controls for all the engines, but you also have controls for individual engines. As we don't have 4 throttles, right, we need to use this one, the throttle axis. I'm gonna press it, and then I'm gonna move the throttle forward. It will assign it to L-axis Z, which simply means this large handler, if you move it forward or backward, that's the axis we're gonna use. In addition to that, we want to use the trim, right, which is on the right side on the picture, but on the left side in the reel. So I'm going to search for trim. If you search for trim, you will find a lot of buttons and a lot of options. In this case, this small button is also an axis. Might sound weird, but it is. So press the option here and then move the wheel slowly. That will set it to joystick slider X. And that's also information which you need to keep in mind, because what you need to do now is go to the hardware settings. Inside the hardware settings, go to the configuration, right, which was slider X if I'm correctly, and then you need to adjust the sensitivity. So the sensitivity, what I did in my case, I moved it back to 0.4 for both the minus and the plus, which will say kind of make it less sensitive in the start area and then make it a little bit more sensitive at the end. And the reason for that is that you in most cases make, I would say, small adjustments. So you could even consider, let's say, moving this one even further to 0.5, right? And you can see that this line almost becomes flat, which is good. And this is how I would do it. However, it's up to you to configure it the way you prefer to use it. So after we've done that, we hit escape and then hit escape back. And now we're going to check if everything works, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to increase the throttle. And as you can see, it works. I'm going to decrease the throttle again. And I'm going to also move that wheel. So I'm going to move the wheel, and what you will see is that it now will move. But as you can see, it goes pretty smooth, doesn't go too fast. And then you can set it in the correct position and then of course take off. So make sure that you check it before taking off. So small recap of what we currently did. So what we did is we configured the yoke, we configured the brakes, we configured the magneto, and we configured the throttle as well as the pitch trim. Now, if I look at myself, the other things which I use a lot are the, I would say, buttons, which are either here or here, right? That's the autopilot. I use it a lot, but I would say, it's what I use. If you're using different buttons, then it's of course up to you which ones you want to use. So what we're going to do is we're going to configure, I would say, a range of buttons. Initially to only control the autopilot as well as the heading mode, the alt mode, the nav mode, the VNV, the approach, and likely the VS and the FLC mode. But let's see how far we come. I will explain all of them, which one you need to select. And then based on that, you can decide, you can follow my instructions, but you can also decide to use it for a different one. So let's hit escape again. And then we're going to go to the settings. Because in the settings, we need to go again to controls. And what we're going to do is we're going to configure the T16000 mic to control most of the buttons. So currently the first 4 have been, I would say, configured. So let's use this one on the left or on the right top, sorry, depends on how you look at it, to switch on the autopilot or switch it off, right? So I'm going to search for autopilot, and don't be surprised, there are so many options for the autopilot. So the first thing we of course want to do is switch on the autopilot or switch it off, right? That's the first thing we want to do. So we're going to scroll to the list where you will find a lot of options, right? You can find the airplanes, you can find also the specific ones. But what I do recommend you to do is stay on the airplanes, because those can be used, I would say, in any aircraft, while these ones can only be used, for example, for the Cessna 172. So keep that in mind. So what are we going to do? We're going to search for autopilot, but to make it a little bit easier, I think it's called Toggle Autopilot Master. That's the one we need. We're going to press the button and then select it. Button number 7, which is this one, has now been configured to switch the autopilot on and off. nothing more, nothing less. Now, what we can do on the right side, which has also 6 buttons, we can find or we can use a lot of autopilot functionalities. For example, one could be to switch on the altitude hold mode, right? That's to simply hold the altitude as you configured. Now, the other thing which you can do is, for example, if we scroll down, you can configure it to toggle the approach hold, right? To activate the approach mode. Then you also see the attitude hold on or off. I don't think it's used in a lot of aircraft, but you could decide to use that one. The back course, of course, when using, for example, ILS sliding, the toggle autopilot heading hold, the localizer hold, the MAC hold, the reference MAC hold. You see so many options are available. It's really up to you which one you want to use. For now, what I'm going to do is the following. So I'm going to set the toggle autopilot hold mode. I'm not going to configure it. Reason for this is that I would use either the vertical speed mode or the flight level change mode, because eventually then it will simply level off at that certain altitude which we configured. And I'm also going to show you how to do that using the buttons on the joystick, right? So let's search for autopilot and then flight. And here you will find the toggle autopilot flight level change. So I'm going to press the button on the, on this side, right? Hard to see, but if you look at the left top of this video, I will show you which one I'm going to use. And then press the button, which is button number 13. Then I would say to use the other mode, right, which is the vertical speed. I'm going to search for autopilot VS, which switches on the autopilot VS hold. And this is the one we need. So I'm going to press it and I'm going to do that. Now for navigation purposes, we've got 2 options, right? We can use the heading hold or we can use the navigation. So the first one is the navigation hold, which we're going to do, or sorry, heading hold. I said navigation, but I of course mentioned heading. And then I'm going to configure the autopilot nav select mode. Now this one is, I would say, a little bit special, as I figured out, because this one requires you to use one of the specific ones, and that's the PFD autopilot navigation button toggle. So I use this one and this works. Keep in mind that it only works if you are flying in this aircraft, because as you can see, it's a specific aircraft profile. So from naming convention perspective, you of course could call it T16000 mic plus TWCS, but keep in mind that you can only use it in case with this specific aircraft, right? So it's really up to you. I will leave it by this, but you can decide to call it differently. So that's the thing which we're going to use. So that's the navigation button toggle. It's a little bit weird that they didn't call it out here, but I'd say that that's what it is. To make sure that this one works, keep in mind that you also need to have a flight plan configured, else it won't work, and you can press it a lot of times, but simply doesn't work at all. Now, for the other parts, what we can do, of course, is we can use it, I'd say, for the landing part, right? So we can say, hey, I want to do the toggle the autopilot approach hold, for example, and then press the button. And you can also use it, for example, for toggle the back course hold, right? So just to be safe. So now we configured all 6 buttons on the right side of the joystick to control the main functionalities of the autopilot. There's of course one button left, which is this one, which you can use for anything, right? So you can use, for example, for the gear, or you could also decide to configure it for the autopilot functionality, but that's really up to you. So let's see if that works. So we're going to go back inside the aircraft. So the first thing is we're going to activate the autopilot, and as you can see, it works because it already activated this part, and you can also see that it's by default the roll and the pitch. So those are the buttons which are working, right? Now the FD, the flight director, I didn't show it yet, but I will show you in a few minutes. That could be also a potential button for the one which hasn't been assigned yet. Now, of course, we've got that, let's say, mode where we want to climb, right? We have that FLC mode. You can press it on the ground, but it will not work. It will work when you're in the air. Keep that in mind. So what you can say, for example, I want to change the altitude. Where is the button? Over here. And then press the FLC. Now it works. It also works on the ground, but you need to set of course, the target altitude. So the FLC mode works, and also the VS mode works, right? So you can quickly change to, let's say, both modes using the buttons over here, which is relatively easy. Now, the other thing, of course, is that we want to steer the aircraft in a direction. That's where the navigation mode comes into play. So press the option now, and you can see it has now changed to heading. And as mentioned already, the other mode, right, the nav mode, you can't use it because of the fact that you didn't program a flight plan. If you would do it, it will work. The same thing is applicable for both the approach mode and the backcourse mode, right? Those will not work unless you pre-programmed the aircraft. So pretty cool. We now covered this button, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one. So we left out, of course, the nose up and down. But as you just saw, I also left out the altitude, where I could simply switch the altitude. And I also left out the VNV mode. So those are things which we're going to look at. For the VNV mode, for this video, I decided to leave it completely out. But of course, you're free to configure it on your joystick to one of those buttons, which is, I would say, remain unused in your configuration. So let's see how we can control the other buttons, like this one and maybe this one, right? Because maybe that's very useful for you. So hit escape again, go to the settings. As the joystick itself has a limited number of options and also a limited number of buttons, what I decided to do is the following, right? If we go to the throttle, you can't see it very well, but on this end of the throttle, there are a lot of buttons, right? In total, there are 1, 2, 3 buttons, which you can use for multiple purposes. So what I decided to do is the following. So if you look at the, for example, altitude, there are 2 things. You can configure the target altitude, but you also can configure the climb speed, right? 100 feet per minute, 200 feet per minute. That's specifically for the VS mode. So if we search for autopilot, VS, oh, of course, need to type it correctly. So what you can do here is switch on and off. You can set the VS hold and set the VS hold and toggle the VS hold. So in some scenarios, what you need to do is remove that part and simply search for the option. And that's not always the nicest thing, of course, what you want to do, but hey, that's how it is. So let's see if we can find the option, right? So we're going to scroll to the list. We can see already some other options, like, for example, the attitude hold on or off, but we also see the reference altitude, as you can see over here, right? So, and you can also see the radio altitude, but that's a different one because this one contains increase, decrease. So let's see if we search for autopilot increase. If we find more, no, that's not very useful. So let's keep it for the autopilot in that case. So we're going to do 2 things. We're going to search for that option, right? And if you search for that option, it might take some time before you find it, because as you can see, it's crazy long, right? You can see a lot of options, including the vertical speed, but this is the option we need, right? So even though you're searching for autopilot VS, it will simply search for autopilot and directly after that VS, but in our case, we should have searched for autopilot reference VS because that has the increase and decrease. So I'm going to use that middle knob, which you see on the left top, by the way, to increase the altitude and decrease the altitude. So button 8 and 10. But as you saw already, there's also an option to increase the altitude, right? So to increase the altitude, so what we're going to do is increase and decrease the reference altitude. Going to use the same button, but now push it up and push it down. Again, all the buttons which I assigned are visible on the left side of this video to make it easier for you to understand. So this is, I would say, the altitude. So let's see if it works, because it's always a good check to make sure that it works. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to increase the altitude, right? And as you can see, I can increase the altitude pretty easy. Here we go. And I can also decrease the altitude. So that works, right? For the second mode, of course, we need to activate that vertical speed, which is over here. And then use that button over here. We can increase or decrease. So also works. So that button was successfully configured, right? So we can, or we don't need to use this one anymore. And we also don't need to use the nose up and down anymore, because we can now use it or do it by using that one button, which has 4 options as part of the joystick. Now, the next thing, of course, that we want to change the heading, right? For example, if I change the heading, you can see that this blue bar moves. But wouldn't it be nice if we could also do that using the one of the joystick buttons? Let's see. So we're going to go to Escape, Settings again, go to the controls, and inside the controls, make sure that the throttle is selected. Inside the throttle, search for autopilot. And there we find a ton of options again. So let's see if we can find the correct option to change the direction of the aircraft, right? Because that's eventually what we want to do. So what you can do is you can, of course, search like I'm doing, but you can also be really smart and find the correct option yourself right away. So what we can do, for example, is we can search for increase and decrease. Let's see if it works. Heading in that case. And if we search for heading, we find an option which is called increase heading buck and decrease heading buck. So those are the buttons which we need. So we're going to press it, I would say, forward if we want to change it, and we're going to pull it to us if we want to go the other direction. So again, going to check it. So, and if you can see, those buttons are now also working, right? So we also don't need this, but need to use this button anymore. So that's really nice, right? We say we're making progress. And as you can see, the autopilot is still on, so we can also switch it off. As you can see, then of course the alert goes off, but that's fine for now. So recap of what we did until now as part of this second part, right? So we configured the majority of these buttons. There are some buttons which we didn't configure yet, but you can do it, of course, if you've got some buttons left on joystick. And we also made sure that we can replace this functionality as well as the heading functionality. So the most functions are working already. So what are some other functions which we want to use? Well, we currently can only go inside or outside the aircraft, but we can't simply look left or right, because that's something which would be useful, as well as resetting the views. So let's see how we can do that. I'm gonna press Escape again. Then we're going to Settings. Inside the settings, we can go to the controls. In this case, make sure that you select the T.16000 mic, because that's the one we want to use. And then, of course, we want to say look left, right, etc. So we're going to search for cockpit. And if you search for cockpit, you will have multiple options. There's the quick view option, which you can see over here. But you also have the view upper and yaw and pitch buttons. So the difference is that if you press these buttons, and if I now press up, press downwards on it, and then press right and press left, it will simply turn in that direction. But as soon as I leave it or release it, it will return to the previous position, right? So this is something which you need to consider if it's very useful for you. But I would say you can use it like this. And this, by the way, the button over here. In some scenarios, you screwed up the view so much that you want to reset the view. So let's also see if we can find it. So if you, let's say, look at this, you can also search for view. Reset. And here you see we've got multiple options, right? We've got the IFR pilot review reset, the landing pilot view reset, and the VFR pilot reset. So depending on which one you want to use, you can search, you can select one of those, but you can also continue to search, because if you're searching for reset, you will find a lot of other options, such as the reset cockpit view. And the reset cockpit view is the one I use. and I would say would love to use it or to continue using it. So that's button number 2. Now the good thing about this is that you can also assign this button to the external view, because currently we can't control the external view. So if we want to reset the external view, you can assign both the buttons, because this button either works when you're inside the aircraft or outside. You could even consider, I would say, assigning it to the drone view, right, if you want. Now you can see that there's a 1 here, which simply means that there is, I would say, it has been assigned to one additional, let's say, control point, which in this case means the external view. So to complete the configuration of, let's say, the cockpit, right? So we're all, or of these 3, of this small joystick on the top, we're also going to make sure that we configure the quick views for the external view, right? So the external view is a little bit different names. I'm not sure on why they did it, but they changed it. So what you can do in this scenario is you can configure it, and then you have got, say, a few options, right? You've got the lockable options, as you can see over here. So you can look down, look right, and then you also have the view look right. So depending on what you prefer to use, choose the one which you want to use. In my case, what I did is I configured the, let me see, it's not lockable. I didn't use the lockable ones. I think I used the view look left, the right. As you can see already the ones behind it, but ignore it for now. And look up, and of course we also need to look down. So these are the ones we want to use. So let's see if everything works, because that's something we want to always validate. So first I'm going to reset the view, which is this case, right? Then I'm going to press it left, works, right, works, up works, and back also works. So this is, I would say, what I meant, right? If I release the joystick, it will return to the original position. Now if I press the external view button, I can do the same thing, right? I can turn left or I can turn right. So this is a little bit different compared to what the button is for inside the cockpit. Well, of course, it's up to you, right? So next thing I want to do is if I look at the left side, it stays at the left side. Or if I look at the right side, it stays at the right side. So let's see how we can do that. And to do that, we're going to do the following. We're going to use that small, I would say, button, which is almost a mini joystick on the back of the throttle. And again, you can see it on the left top of this video to change that view. So I'm going to search for cockpit view. And I will see a lot of options. So in this case, there's something which is super important, because it's already, as I mentioned, it's kind of a joystick, right? It's the one over here. You need to use one of those axis options, because it's not a button, it's an axis. So what you can either do is you can scroll down the list and find the options, or you could follow me, where you can simply say, okay, hey, the general yaw axis and the pitch axis, those can be configured, for example. So let me do that, right? So I'm gonna yaw axis, yaw axis is the X, and pitch axis is this one. And let's see how that works, right? So let's do that. So if we now move to the left and to the right, you can see I can now freely look, and I can also look upwards and downwards. In some case, you might want to reverse the options. So to do that, what you can do is you can go back to the settings, and inside the settings, go to the view you just configured. Cockpit view, easier. And then press that small gear over here, and you will have the option to say set inverted axis. That will simply turn around, right? So down will be up, and up will be down, and left will be right, and right will be left. So that's everything you can do. In addition to that, there's one other option which we didn't discuss, and that's if you made a mistake, how you can delete the setting. Well, that's relatively easy. By pressing the delete assigned control, that clears it, or by searching this long list and then removing it from here. So all kind of cool settings, right? We configured a lot of options already, but while we're talking, we forgot, of course, a really important option, and that's to use the flaps. right? Because currently we can't control the flaps. Well, we could do it using the mouse, but that's not realistic. So let's see if we can assign a button to the flaps. Now, of course, the question is, okay, hey, which button do you want to assign to it? Again, it's really up to you. But what you could do, for example, is use either those pedals, right? Let me show it in the, not to the main menu. What you could do is you could use the pedals over here, for example, to increase or decrease the flaps, but also there's a small button over here. And I would prefer to use this one. So I'm going to do is I'm going to search for flaps. And inside the flaps, you will have an option where you can say, hey, I want to increase or decrease the flaps. That's the option over here, right? Decrease or increase. So decrease and increase can be configured the way you want it, right? You can either say, hey, I want to use button 4 or button number 5 for it. But you can also turn it around, right? What you prefer to do. In this case, you can see it's again assigned to that airplane section and not to the specific ones. However, you could also do it for the aircraft specific ones. So now we can control the flaps. Really makes sense. So now we can, I would say, move that one around. You can see that the, maybe zoom in a bit. You can see that we can push it and also pull it upwards again. So that, it's really nice, right? So now there, of course, are a lot of buttons which we don't use yet, right? Which I'm completely aware of. However, this is the basic configuration which you could use to control the aircraft, which already gives you a lot of capabilities. And if you would think about buttons which you would press a lot, right? You would likely focus on this area, right? These are the buttons to, for example, switch on the lights, switch off the lights. And especially the landing and taxi lights could be something which you could, say, decide to configure, right? So let's see how we can do that. So we're going to go over to the settings menu. Inside the settings menu, go again to controls. It becomes a little bit of repetition, right? And then search for landing lights. So landing lights, right? We can simply switch them on or off, right? And then we need to have the toggle landing lights. And we're going to use the small joystick on this side to do that. So we're going to press it forward. That will switch on the landing lights. Now, if we would like to do the same thing for the taxi lights, we simply search for taxi. Also there you need to search for the toggle taxi lights and then kind of push it forward. That's something which you could do. And if you want to make it even nicer, you can also search for light to see what other options are available, right? You can simply also create one button which switches on all the lights. Doesn't make sense in most cases, but for example, the beacon lights can be switched on or off, as well as the maybe the recognition lights. No, toggle beacon lights. Set beacon. Oh, see, now I need to use the delete option, because I need to have the, of course, the toggle beacon lights upwards and downwards. So now the only thing which we didn't use is the recognition lights and the wing lights, which are applicable only to certain aircrafts, right? So now what we could do, if we go inside, we can switch on the taxi lights, switch on the landing lights, or the way around, switch on the beacon light and switch on the nav light. The only thing which we can't switch on is the strobe, but that's of course up to you which ones you prefer to use. Now there's something which we didn't discuss yet. It's of course the gear, right? That's another bonus item. In this case, it does make sense to configure it. Reason for it is because the Cessna 172, you can't, let's say, pull up the gears, but let's see how you would normally do that. So we're going to go to the settings menu. Inside the settings menu, we find the correct controller and then search for gear. And inside the gear menu, you simply say toggle landing gear and then press the button you prefer to use. In my case, I prefer to use this one. Makes a lot of sense for me, but it's up to you. The other option, of course, if you want to make it really, I would say, cool, you can use one of the buttons to do the gear down and the other one to do the gear up, right? Works exactly the same, only then you are, I would say, need to use two buttons instead of one. And since you might be limited to the number of buttons, you might prefer to choose them wisely. And with this, we're at the end of this video where we looked at how to create a combination of the T16000 mic with the TWCS throttle. We use the throttle for throttling, but also to configure, for example, the altitude or the navigation heading for the autopilot, as well as to change some views, right? To, say, freely look around, I would call it. But also to trim the pitch rate. The joystick itself, we use it for switching on the aircraft, the engines, switching off, parking brake part, but also to steer the aircraft, right? We need to, let's say, elevate it into the air to change the pitch rate. We need to steer left or right, or we need to change the rudder. But in addition to that, we also looked at how you can use the buttons to use the autopilot functionalities which are available in this aircraft. I hope you liked it. If you liked it, then make sure to hit that like button, because that tells me that I need to create more of these videos. And of course, if you want to search for other configurations for these, for example, if you only have the T16000 mic or only have the throttle, then have a look at my channel, because there are multiple videos about this topic, which will help you configuring those devices to use them at maximum pace. Thanks for watching, and see you back next time.